Okay, well, before I start the talk itself, I want to recognize that we're meeting here tonight on the traditional, the ancestral, and the unceded territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people. And as Bob mentioned, I'm currently working on a project that explores the radical social movement activism in Canada between the 1960s and the 1980s. And one of the arguments that's at the center of my work and at the center of my teaching is that radical voices, radical ideas, radical actions deserve our attention. And they do so in part because they've done a lot for us. So, for example, many of the things that we take for granted today, say universal health care, old age pensions, certainly unions, to give three mundane examples, are the direct product of radical movements, radical organizations in the past. These movements, organized in different times by communists, socialists, anarchists, and other radicals, have made our lives, have made our communities healthier, safer, and more equitable. Radicalism, however, also matters for its failures, for its brutal failures, and for the harm that it's done in the world. And we only need to look through the pages of Vancouver's socialist press in the early decades of the century to see its overt and heartbreaking racism, particularly its vicious treatment of Chinese, Japanese, and South Asian workers, and its almost complete silence on the plight of the indigenous working class. But radicalism doesn't just matter because of these two things. It doesn't just matter for what good it's done or for the bad things that it's done. Instead, for many historians, and myself included, radicalism is important because it offers us alternative ways of seeing and understanding the world. Radicalism, in short, gives us perspectives that we would not otherwise get if we only listened to the voices of the dominant social order. I would argue that this is always important, but it's particularly important at this moment because as we move towards the 150th celebration of Confederation, we're likely to encounter historical narratives and public commentary that will seek to glorify and romanticize Canada as a peaceable kingdom. Within these narratives, we're unlikely to hear stories and perspectives that emphasize the violence of Canada's colonial, capitalist, and patriarchal past. And that violence is very real, and it's ongoing. We're also unlikely to hear from people who have continually resisted these aspects of Canada, often in militant and aggressive ways. And that's a problem. It's a problem because the erasure, right, the silencing of radical perspectives sanitizes the past by removing the deep and extensive patterns of political conflict that have marked Canadian history. It's also a problem because it simplifies the past by removing from it alternative ideas about what Canada is, where it came from, what its future might be, and what the methods of creating that future might entail. So what I want to argue tonight, sort of generally speaking, big picture, is that we take radicalism seriously. In doing so, I hope that we can uncover a side of our past that not only goes unremarked, but also actively challenges the whitewashed version of our past that we often get in these public moments of commemoration and celebration. And I want to do this by turning to the 1970s and the 1980s to explore the radicalism of two overlapping and underground groups, Direct Action and the Women's Fire Brigade. As many of you will know, in fact, as many of you may remember, these two groups organized three high-profile acts of sabotage during the early 1980s. In May of 1982, Direct Action bombed the partially completed Chekai-Dunsmuir hydroelectric power station on Vancouver Island, an action that built upon a deep pattern of anger and resentment against the provincial utilities' environmental policies. 4 months later, they bombed an Ontario factory that was producing parts for the American government's controversial cruise missile program, a program that created some of the largest protests in Canadian history. In the fall of 1982, 2 members from Direct Action joined with 7 other militant feminists in order to firebomb 3 pornography stores in the greater Vancouver area. They claimed this action under the name of the Women's Fire Brigade and positioned it as an act of self-defense against the violence associated with pornography. Eventually, the police located and arrested 5 individuals in connection with these events: Ann Hansen, Jerry Hanna, Brent Taylor, Doug Stewart, and Juliet Belmas. In the aftermath of their arrest, the press labeled these activists as the Vancouver Five, sometimes the Squamish Five, sometimes just simply the Five. They were charged with and convicted of multiple criminal offenses and sentenced from jail terms ranging from life in prison to 6 years. They've all since been released. While the Vancouver Five are well known to many people who lived through or remember the early 80s, there's been almost no substantial historical explanation of where they came from, what they attempted to do, or why they might matter for our understanding of the past, the present, or the future. In fact, the very idea that we might learn something from the Five is almost never even suggested. It's almost never contemplated. Instead, because of their small numbers, the short duration of their activity, and particularly because they took up arms, they're either dismissed as irrelevant or defined as a group of irrational zealots who are the antithesis of unacceptable politics, or sorry, the antithesis of acceptable politics and acceptable protest. In both cases, right, in both these assessments, the end result is that we're prevented from learning anything about them or the world that they lived in, because what's the point in asking serious questions about irrational or irrelevant people? But if we start from the presumption that radicalism is important, then we need to push back against this type of marginalization. And one of the ways to do that is by putting the Vancouver Five into their historical context, to show that while they were particular in some ways, they were also not alone in their concerns, not even alone in their tactics. Instead, what I'm going to argue tonight is that Direct Action and the Women's Fire Brigade were part of a broad pattern of radical activism, a pattern that linked Vancouver to a host of radical movements both within and beyond the city's boundaries. And I'm going to do this in 2 ways. First, we're going to follow 2 members of Direct Action, Brent Taylor and Ann Hansen, as they travel through the revolutionary underground of the United States and Europe, travels that brought them in contact with a wide range of clandestine and urban groups. As we're going to see, this exposure to new radical environments in the second half of the 70s shaped their decision to create their own guerrilla projects back in Vancouver in the early 1980s. And the second thing that we're going to do is focus in on one of those actions associated with the Five, the arson of pornographic video stores in Vancouver in the fall of 1982. But rather than dismissing or marginalizing this radical activity, we're going to historicize it. We're going to historicize it to see what it has to tell us about the radical landscape of Vancouver. And my whole point about all of this is that the Women's Fire Brigade weren't rogue rebels, but rather an extension of pre-existing patterns of discontent and radical activism. But before we turn to this trip abroad, there's a few things that need saying. First, although they had different connections to different places, Direct Action and the Women's Fire Brigade were primarily based out of Vancouver. It was in Vancouver that Hansen, Taylor, Belmas, Hanna, and Stewart came to know each other as a group. And it was here that they spent most of their time, planning the acts of sabotage that would transform them into internationally known political dissidents in the years to come. However, the Five are only one small part of a much larger, much older radical Vancouver. From the earliest colonial moments on Burrard Inlet, Indigenous people resisted, contested, and negotiated their place within settlers' society. Take, for example, the Bows and Arrows Brigade, a local of the radical industrial workers of the world. You can see one of their graphics here. The Bows and Arrows were an example of a union organization where indigenous and non-indigenous dock workers fought through the daily grind, wielding the tools of direct action and racial solidarity. There was also the radical Vancouver of the 1920s and the 1930s that Bob mentioned, a world seemingly defined by communists and their struggles against the ravages of the Depression, and in particular against the anti-labor violence of companies and the police. But the most important radical Vancouver for our purposes tonight was the one defined by the social movements and activist organizations of the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s. This period saw a huge expansion in the transformation in the scope of radical activism, often pushed by the development of new movements and organizations. Organizations such as the Native Alliance for Red Power and the American Indian Movement. Here you have a picture of the famous, or infamous, depending on your perspective, American Indian Movement activist Leonard Peltier, as he's being led out of Ocala prison to be extradited to the United States, where he would spend, and is to this day, in prison. It was also shaped by countercultural new leftists, such as the Youth International Party, who were perhaps the only activists who would think to break into a prison, right? Yippie did flamboyant, crazy protests. And here they are breaking down the walls of Ocala to have a be-in inside the prison. It's also shaped by environmental movements. Of course, Greenpeace, the most well-known. Here's an image of them in 1971 as they're about to disrupt American nuclear tests in the Pacific. Also shaped by queer movements, such as the Vancouver Gay Liberation Front and the Gay Alliance Towards Equality, which puts forward a series of public protests, one here from 1981, the Gay Unity Pride in Vancouver. These movements were strongly shaped by local dynamics in the city, but they were also deeply affected by the global nature of social protest. In the context of the Vietnam War, for example, as many of you may remember, the media played an incredibly important role in the expansion of anti-war activism by bringing the atrocities that were taking place in Southeast Asia into the living rooms, into the daily lives of everyday people. But it wasn't just the media that connected activists in Vancouver to movements and issues elsewhere. Political travel, the idea, the act of traveling to other places for political purposes that mixed politics and leisure together, was also incredibly important. And this is certainly true for Brent Taylor and Ann Hansen, both of whom have noted how travel abroad shaped the political activity that they would then bring back to Canada. So with this in mind, I'm going to take you on two short political trips. The first, Brent Taylor goes to San Francisco. Five years before he participated in the creation of Direct Action, Brent Taylor was a disgruntled poli-sci undergrad at the University of Victoria. In his early 20s, in the mid-1970s, he'd been active in the emerging anti-nuclear and environmental movements that were a prominent part of radical politics on the coast. Rather than studying for his courses at UVic, however, Taylor spent the majority of his time reading and thinking about American revolutionary movements such as the Black Panther Party, the Weather Underground, and the always mysterious Symbionese Liberation Army, movements that he would have been able to explore through the pages of radical journals such as The Dragon. By 1975, Taylor was no longer content to simply read about this radical world. He wanted to visit. So he packed his bags and he left for one of its principal centers, the San Francisco Bay Area. One of Taylor's first stops in the city was a radical left-wing bookstore called New Dawn Books. It was run by what Taylor referred to as a group of, quote, Maoist hippie freaks. And he's using that in a good term, right? That's a positive thing for him, right? New Dawn was Taylor's gateway into the American underground. For example, by hanging around at New Dawn, Taylor was able to meet and make connections with elements of the Weather Underground, as well as other Bay Area guerrilla groups, including the New World Liberation Front, and the Emiliano Zapata unit, both of whom were responsible for a slate of bombings in the San Francisco area, particularly against Safeway. Eventually, activists connected with this bookstore offered Taylor a place to stay in their collective house. It was at this point that Taylor realized and learned that both New Dawn and the house that he was staying at were closely affiliated with the Emiliano Zapata unit, one of these armed revolutionary groups in San Francisco. Like the bookstore, the house that he was staying at was a place where Taylor was exposed to an eclectic range of Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, and other third world revolutionary ideas, as it was called then. However, what often struck Taylor most about living in this radical collective house was what he referred to as its, quote, disciplined environment. Here, the mundane contours of everyday life, from the time at which political discussions took place to who did the dishes and when, was organized and directed by senior members of the collective. The collective developed these patterns of living to train activists in the rigors of self-discipline and hierarchical top-down organization, values that they saw as critical for the creation of a revolutionary vanguard, for a professional group of committed full-time revolutionaries. At the same time that Taylor was experiencing this radical domestic life, he was also engaging in public political work for the EZU. Walking around the streets of Oakland, Taylor and other low-level supporters pasted the group's propaganda on telephone poles and other available surfaces of the city. Eventually, these associations garnered enough attention from the police that he decided to flee the city, to skip town. He did so at the end of 1976, leaving with a comrade who'd worked as a political graffitiist for several Bay Area groups. The plan was to make for Boston, to try and make contact with radical groups there. Unfortunately, however, for Taylor and the graffitiists, their trip to Massachusetts was foiled after the police arrested them in Michigan. The graffitiist was taken away, and Taylor was unceremoniously deported to Windsor, Ontario. Although we never saw his traveling companion again, Taylor's trip east from California provided him with time to reflect on these political travels to the Bay Area. On the one hand, he was seriously impressed with what local armed groups had accomplished. After all, activists had conducted numerous armed attacks, they'd integrated those actions into popular community campaigns, and they'd almost always gotten away with it. As a result, by the time he left California, Taylor had decided that developing an underground form of political armed struggle back in Canada was something that he was very much interested in pursuing. At the same time, he was also conflicted about the ideological contours of this radicalism. He learned a lot from his Marxist-Leninist and Maoist colleagues, but he was also somewhat disappointed with their approaches. Ultimately, he found them, in his words, quote, too rigid in their ideological commitments, too inflexible, too authoritarian, right? Too controlling, too strict. For Taylor, anarchism offered him an out of this dilemma. In anarchism, Taylor found a body of political traditions that could support popular insurrection, armed activity, while avoiding this top-down, hierarchical, controlling style of leadership that defined so many of the groups of the 1970s and 1980s. So, in the end, political travel was an important inspiration for Taylor, since it provided him with the experiences of working and living in the American underground. Anne Hansen's experience with radical urban guerrilla communities outside of Canada also pushed her towards her eventual work with Direct Action and the Women's Fire Brigade. But like Taylor, her exposure to the radical left started in Canada. Hansen's first introduction to radical politics came when she enrolled in the University of Waterloo in 1978, where she studied radical politics and became involved in a Maoist student group. As with Taylor, however, Hansen's time working with the far left produced mixed results. On the one hand, a vigorous exposure to Marxist ideas of class and capitalism provided her with an inspirational framework for understanding the world. As she told me in an interview, quote, "For a short while, it became the answer to so many of my questions." On the other hand, she also found the group to be overly controlling and dictatorial. There was, at least in her experience, a very particular, very strict ideological line that members of the group had to follow. In the end, these ideological contours were too alienating, and she left the group and moved towards an anarchist sensibility. At the same time as these political changes were taking place in her life, she left for Europe. Like Taylor, she was captivated by the militancy of radical social movements outside of Canada and was determined to see them firsthand. Leaving in 1979, she spent a short time in London and then made her way to Paris. In general, Hansen found Paris to be a vastly more political place than Canada. Nothing highlighted this more than the large labor demonstrations that would continually, routinely, almost weekly it seemed, bring thousands of people into the streets of Paris. But it was also in that city that Hansen first experienced the world of underground political activity. From a contact in London, she contacted a French support network for the West German group, the Red Army Faction, who conducted numerous attacks, including assassinations, against American military institutions and right-wing and fascist elements in West Germany. For nearly 6 months, she lived and worked with this collective in their Paris apartment, putting out leaflets, aiding RAF fugitives who were fleeing West Germany and traveling to West Germany to attend the criminal trials of RAF militants and their supporters. Working with this RAF support group provided her with a long period of time, a bunch of exposure to the theory and practices of urban guerrilla politics, as well as the excitement of living a life completely defined by militant activity. And what struck her most was the dedication that her flatmates put into their political work, the way that it was ingrained in almost everything that they did. Daily life around the apartment, doing the dishes, doing laundry, not photocopying, but making copies of documents. All of these were infused with discussions of armed struggle, the limitations of legal protest. Although she objected to the RAF's use of political assassination, she concluded that urban guerrilla collectives could be viable, could be effective. Willing and capable to do this work, she made a conscious decision to throw herself into the underground. By 1980, Hansen had relocated herself back to Canada, and in that year she met Brent Taylor at a party in Toronto. It didn't take long for the two to realize that they had a lot in common: support for anarchist politics and a desire to increase the militancy of politics in Canada through creating a clandestine front. As a result, Taylor invited Hansen to come out west. She took him up on his offer, and the two were soon engaged in creating their urban guerrilla project in Vancouver. These two stories of political travel, they're not the only way to explain the origins of direct action. Other members of the group didn't travel in this way. And travel didn't give Hansen or Taylor their radicalism in any comprehensive sense, right? After all, both of them were activists before they left on these trips. Instead, a more modest conclusion would be that travel was important because it gave them prolonged and unmitigated access to radical networks and militant practices. Travel abroad was inspirational. However, just because it was inspirational didn't mean that the two Canadians accepted everything that they experienced. Still, the idea of creating an urban guerrilla project, one that would be able to extend and expand the scope of militancy in Canada, at least from their perspective, that was something that absolutely was profoundly influenced by their time in San Francisco and Paris. Nevertheless, it was back in Canada that these urban guerrilla perspectives were put into practice. And here you can see the aftermath of one of those, right? This is the first action that direct action took, the smoldering remains of BC Hydro's substation on Vancouver Island. Before we turn to the attacks on Red Hot Video, let me spend just a minute explaining how direct action approached the use and definition of armed action. First of all, as I mentioned a minute ago, they rejected targeting human beings with violence. This is an important distinction to set out because motives matter a lot when it comes to the interpretation of politics and ideology. Direct action particularly rejected the military strategies of terrorism, strategies that suggested that intentional acts of violence against unarmed civilians could be an effective form of psychological or physical warfare against one's opponent. Direct action categorically rejected these strategies on both moral and tactical grounds. Instead, they promoted clandestine attacks against property. And as a result, direct action, the Women's Fire Brigade deployed the tactics of sabotage. And they did so for two primary reasons. First, they saw sabotage as a practical way of contributing to specific social movements. The objective here was to physically obstruct, through bombings, through arson, the industrial or commercial projects that were politically unpopular and against the best interests of the public as they understood it. Second, direct action and the Women's Fire Brigade designed their armed actions as moments of militant communication and symbolic critique. So here, armed actions, amplified through the media, operated as a form of propaganda. Armed attacks didn't just destroy things. They didn't just break things. They highlighted grievances. They told stories, or they attempted to. And they did so in order to criticize and hopefully, from their perspective, to inspire. To help them make these points, written statements were released after actions in order to explain why they happened and what the point was. However, direct action had no illusions that they would make headway on any issue through bombs alone. Instead, they saw their contributions as only one aspect of a well-designed and carried out public campaign. For this reason, both direct action and the Women's Fire Brigade chose targets that had already been the subject of extensive patterns of public protest. In doing so, they articulated their use of sabotage as an action of last resort, as a tool for those moments when the strategies of legal reform, the strategies of civil disobedience had failed to achieve results, and where the costs of not acting were too dire to contemplate. So these are the things that we rarely think about or rarely talk about when we consider the Vancouver Five, that their attacks were part of a planned strategy rooted in a broader pattern of activist politics. And this matters because it puts them into a context that can help explain their actions and perspectives. And in doing so, provide us with a view of Canadian politics that we almost never get. In order to take a closer look at this, to see what we can get from taking this radicalism seriously, I want to turn to an action associated with the Five that tells us the most about the political landscape of Vancouver, and that's the Women's Fire Brigade arsons against Red Hot Video. And just a warning, I'm going to be talking about sexual violence and pornography in this section of this talk. So if you're uncomfortable, if you want to leave, of course, at any time, please do so. The arsons of Red Hot Video took place in the fall of 1982. But in order to understand why they happened and why they matter, we need to go back earlier to the late 1960s and travel across, in fact, the 1970s. If we do this, then it quickly becomes evident that the Women's Fire Brigade attacks against Red Hot Video didn't emerge out of nowhere, but instead developed out of two entwined factors. First, the development of a vigorous feminist movement that was determined to combat sexism in the media and violence against women. And second, a huge expansion in pornography as a popular and vibrant industry. But let's deal with feminism first. At the end of the 60s and the early 70s, women across Canada began to create new types of feminist activism, often referred to as women's liberation. And Vancouver was one of the most important settings for this emerging pattern of action. Take, for example, the creation in 1969 of the Vancouver Women's Caucus, an organization that helped to organize the 1970 abortion caravan, a monumental cross-country protest that took activists from Vancouver to Ottawa to advocate for women's access to and control over abortion services. Feminists in Vancouver were also responsible for remaking the labor movement by creating innovative organizations such as the Service, Office and Retail Workers Union of Canada, or SORWOC, which was an explicitly socialist feminist union. While healthcare and workplace organizing were important issues in Vancouver, so were the struggles against media sexism. One of the earliest organizations to take this work up was the Vancouver Status of Women, or the VSW. Formed in 1971, it was one of the largest and most influential feminist organizations in the province. It used policy reform, legal reform to fight back against sexism, but it also advocated for consumer action. To do so, it often published examples of sexist ads in the feminist press and called on readers to respond through letter writing and the threat of consumer boycott. So, for example, in May of '74, the KINESIS feminist paper in Vancouver reproduced this advertisement by Benson and Hedges cigarettes, a tobacco product that, as you probably know or may know, particularly marketed towards women. It's a bit of a dark ad. I don't know if you can see it really well, but at the front of the ad, you see a pair of women's legs, right? Only her legs. She's probably wearing a short skirt. It's hard to tell, but her legs are definitely bare from the thighs down to the feet. And in the background, you of course see two male construction workers emerge from a hole in the street to leer at this woman. Connecting the length of the company's cigarettes to the length of the woman's legs, the ad proclaimed that, like Benson and Hedges, the longer the better. VSW members such as Karen Richardson responded by criticizing how the ad positioned women as, quote, mindless sexual objects, and promised a boycott until the company changed its ads. In doing this work, feminists argued continuously that they were not arguing against sex. Instead, they maintained that these ads should be opposed because they were built around frameworks of desire in which women's bodies were only worthwhile as an item of male sexual consumption. Repeated thousands of times per day through thousands of different products on television shows, movies, and other forms of media, these sexist images were understood by feminists to have vast influence over how women were treated, both publicly and privately. But boycotts and legal pressure weren't the only tactics that feminists used to combat sexist advertisements in the city. Starting in the second half of the 70s, some women turned to creative acts of sabotage. For example, in 1977, the Vancouver collective Women Against Sexist Advertising attacked 15 Safeway billboards that displayed ads for women's stockings. Here, Safeway, and this was really stupid, used the identical image from the Benson and Hedges ad from before. It's just dumb. It was a bad idea. The only change was the text, which now read, "The eye catchers, Safeway pantyhose." Hitting the ads at night, Women Against Sexist Advertising used spray paint to write sexist across the large billboards. While the Vancouver Status of Women claimed not to know who was behind the action, they said that they, quote, very much admired these paintings. Other feminists were also complimentary, including the BC Federation of Women, the Women's Printing Collective Press Gang, and the media collective Women in Focus, all of whom publicly endorsed and supported these attacks on Safeway. And these were not isolated acts. The following year, the anarchist feminist collective Revolting Women modified numerous forms of oppressive public advertising. Like Women Against Sexist Advertising, Revolting Women specialized in graffiti. Targeting the ads at night, they transformed one billboard from reading "Step Lively" to "Step Lively, Stop Sexism." A Coppertone ad for suntan lotion that used a mostly nude woman went from reading "Beautiful tan, beautiful skin" to "Beautiful tan, beautiful skin, ugly sexism." Additionally, paint splattered on billboards rendered sexist copy useless, while homemade stickers and felt pens modified smaller advertisements on buses. Radicals in Vancouver, as well as elsewhere, often argued that graffiti was a critical tool for public communication because it gave everyday people a free and unmediated space to comment on the world. But the work of revolting women and other groups was different from standard forms of graffiti writing because it also functioned as an act of sabotage. Changing the appearance of an ad, after all, undercut its authority, right? It focuses the attention of the viewer away from the product and towards the words of the graffiti writer. In this way, activists sabotaged the functionality of an ad by transforming its intended consumer message into a feminist message. Since no business could allow these alterations to their property to take place, billboard modifications also forced economic concessions from the company through the cleaning and replacement of ads. These patterns of feminist resistance, both legal, illegal, anarchist, non-anarchist, were carried over into the struggles against pornography. And these struggles were particularly significant in the context of the 1960s and the 80s because the size of the pornography industry was expanding and its content was becoming more violent. Why? Why was this the case? To put it very simply, social attitudes towards sexual content in popular culture had changed in the context of the 60s. As a result, social expectations about what was normal had changed. There was more tolerance for overt and explicit sexual references in popular culture. And at the same time, governments in Canada, the United States, and other places relaxed obscenity legislation in ways that made the production, the dissemination, and the consumption of pornography much easier than it had been. The result was a massive boom in pornography beginning in the 1970s. The arrival of new publications, including Hustler in 1974 and Penthouse in 1977, demonstrated the growing diversity and the lucrative nature of selling sexual imagery. Hustler and Penthouse also reflected a shift towards more explicit sexual genres that were often referred to as hardcore. Hardcore focused on forms of sexual content, including images of penetration and male ejaculation that had been absent from the pornography of the 1950s and the 1960s. It was new content in hardcore. But hardcore also embraced violence. Hustler's comic strip, Chester the Molester, depicted the repeated kidnapping, manipulating, and assaulting of women and girls. The magazine's 1978 cover, which featured a woman's naked body being put through a meat grinder, did nothing to alleviate activist concerns over hardcore pornography's treatment of women. However, the most prominent and symbolic reflection of pornography's connection with violence against women was probably the 1975 film Snuff. And just a warning, I'm going to show an image here in a second of a promotional picture from Snuff, and it's quite graphic. So if you want to turn away, do so now, and then I'll tell you when it's safe to look at the image again. Produced by the American filmmaker Alan Shackleton, Snuff depicts one of the female participants being brutally tortured, killed, and disemboweled on camera. Now, I don't have time to talk about everything that's going on in this poster. There's a lot, but what I do want to acknowledge is the politics of race and global capitalism that allow this poster to claim, as you can see at the bottom, that some women's lives are cheaper than others, right? This film, it could only happen in South America where life is cheap, which only makes sense in the context of the 1980s by the brutal social conflicts that are taking place in places like Nicaragua, El Salvador, and other places. Rather than being a gruesome act of fiction, and this is crucial, rather than being pitched as fiction, the killing that takes place in Snuff is presented to the viewer as real violence. Okay, that slides over. While these claims to authentic murder were eventually proven to be a hoax, the film enraged feminists across North America and helped to catalyze this emerging, growing anti-pornography opposition. One of the earliest calls to contest pornography here in BC came in February of 1976, when the Vancouver Status of Women writer Karen Richardson raised the issue in the feminist paper KINESIS. Richardson rejected the notion that sexual liberation necessitated support for pornography, right? This idea that comes forward in the 1960s that if you were a hip, liberated woman, you should accept things like this. No, she didn't accept that. Nor did she advocate for women's, quote, equal opportunity in pornography. It wasn't as if you just gave women more control over the pornography industry, sort of liberal feminist argument that this would solve the problem. That wasn't it. Instead, Richardson argued that pornography, quote, turned off women for two interconnected reasons. First, it was an industry designed by and for men, and second, because it, quote, dehumanizes, abuses, and discards us. And nothing demonstrated this more than pornography's embracement of rape. Implicitly referencing the expansion of hardcore, films like Snuff, Richardson contested what she saw as the chic status of pornography in the 70s and maintained that its continual association with sexual assault against women demonstrated that pornography was a form of, quote, anti-female propaganda. As part of this focus on violence, organizers wove discussions of pornography into their community activism against sexual assault. What this meant was that by the 1980s, Vancouver's feminist movements were taking increasingly public stands against pornography. This work was done not only by feminist journals such as KINESIS and the Vancouver Status of Women, but also involved the activism of the BC Federation of Women, Rape Relief, Women Against Pornography, Women Against Violence Against Women, as well as a host of other women's shelters and independent women's groups. And so it was in this context, this political context, that the pornographic retailer Red Hot Video opened its doors to the public in 1982. Opening one store would have been bad enough, but the fact that Red Hot Video quickly opened 12 stores in the Lower Mainland and one in Victoria, all within the first year, produced a shockwave of anger that rolled across the province. And at the heart of this anger was the argument that Red Hot Video was profiting off prohibited sexual material. Here, a wide range of critics, and it wasn't just feminists, but it was municipal officials, church groups, professional associations, particularly teachers, maintained that many of the films stocked and rented by Red Hot Video were in violation of 159 of the Criminal Code. This section was entitled Offenses Tending to Corrupt Morals, and it forbid, among various things, the publication of material in which sex was communicated through crime, horror, cruelty, and violence. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I don't claim to know whether this is a convincing legal argument, but some things are clear. First, Red Hot Video did use categories such as rape as an identifying characteristic for their films, despite the fact that the company initially denied this in the press. And we know this because activists were able to gain copies of Red Hot Video's X-rated movie handbook, which systematically organized and categorized its collection according to certain keywords. Using these industry definitions, activists alleged that Red Hot Video carried a minimum of 13 rape films. They also counted within that same collection 13 films categorized under, quote, young girls, a number of which also had catalog descriptions such as, quote, unwilling, attached to their titles. It's also clear that Red Hot Video must have been in violation of some government regulations because by June of 1982, the police had seized over 30 tapes from their collection. Nevertheless, the state's punitive actions stopped there. By the summer of 1982, no charges or fines had been brought against Red Hot Video. But this certainly didn't reflect a lack of effort on the part of activists. The first protests against Red Hot Video appeared in May, 3 months after the stores began appearing in the city. Here, the North Shore Women's Center and the Port Coquitlam Women's Center were particularly active in creating a public campaign against the stores. Pickets were organized at some locations, and a growing amount of pressure was placed on the Attorney General and the police to take action. To help make their case, the women who led the campaign often used sympathetic men, often their partners, to go into Red Hot video locations in order to rent certain films that they thought violated the criminal code, right? So they send in spies, basically. These activists then turned tapes over to the state in order to pressure them to take action, or they watched them themselves and wrote reviews, porn reviews, feminist porn reviews, and talked about it in the media. And on at least one occasion, they hosted public events in which they burned these cassettes in the street. In the face of these initial protests, the police and the Crown told activists that this lack of prosecution against the company could be explained by three general things. First of all, they said prosecution was very costly. The courts were overloaded with criminal cases. And the Crown had had serious trouble prosecuting Playboy in the 1960s. Activists were not convinced. Reflecting on this pattern of inaction, the North Shore Women's Center wrote, quote, "We have been told many times that prosecution has not solved the pornography business. We say prosecution has not solved the larceny, robbery, mugging, or murder business either, but then again, prosecutions are not withheld on that account." As with past struggles against sexist advertising, activists generally opposed pornography because they understood that what happened on screen influenced what happened in society at large. Pornography was understood as a form of ideology, as a component of misogyny, and as such was responsible for shaping the minds and actions of those who consumed it. This was especially true when it came to violent pornography. The popular phrase at the time, "porn is the theory, rape is the practice," encapsulated this idea succinctly. Activists also worked hard to ensure that their critiques of Red Hot video were not interpreted as being anti-sex. It's a hard thing to do. Many groups in this debate attempted to draw a distinction between what they referred to as pornography and what they saw as erotica, although the contours of that debate and the definition of those terms was incredibly difficult, and it was all very diverse. Nevertheless, all activists certainly agreed that consent, a word that we hear a lot today, needed to be at the center of sex, and this seemed to be missing from the material in Red Hot video collection. The argument was also made that the company's films contain instances of actual rape and other forms of real violence, not just simply fiction. And these arguments were, in many ways, the product of this assumption, of the assumptions made about snuff, that films were being made that contained real violence. The stakes, therefore, seem to be of the highest importance. And in this context, it seemed that many people that should have been acting, the Crown, the police, were doing nothing. So, it was for these reasons, the violence of hardcore both on and off the screen, the phenomenal expansion of the Red Hot video franchise, the inaction of the state, and the development of a committed feminist movement, that the Women's Fire Brigade was created. While Ann Hansen and Juliet Belmas were involved in the arsons, it's important not to conflate direct action and the Women's Fire Brigade. There was overlap between the two organizations, but they weren't the same group of people. In mid-November, these 9 women who called themselves the Women's Fire Brigade gathered to collectively write the communique that they would release in the wake of the attack and to hash out the details of their actions. On the night of November the 22nd, 1982, 9 women separated themselves off into 3 groups of 3, each one moving towards a different Red Hot video location, one in North Vancouver, one in Port Coquitlam, and one in Surrey. With various incendiary devices, they attacked these 3 stores. The North Van Red Hot video was significantly damaged. The one in Port Coquitlam was spared when the fire refused to spread. The store in Surrey, however, was almost completely incinerated. In fact, the blaze was so intense that it spread to a few other shops on either side of the video store. The following day, media outlets and activist groups around the Lower Mainland received the Women's Fire Brigade communique. It read as follows. We, the Women's Fire Brigade, claim responsibility for the firebombing of 3 Red Hot video outlets in the lower mainland of BC on November the 22nd, 1982. This action is another step towards the destruction of a business that promotes and profits from the violence against women and children. Red Hot Video sells tapes that show women and children being tortured, raped, and humiliated. We are not the property of men to be used and abused. Red Hot Video is part of a multi-billion-dollar pornography industry that teaches men to equate sexuality with violence. Although these tapes violate the Criminal Code of Canada and the BC Guidelines on Pornography, all lawful attempts to shut down Red Hot Video have failed because the justice system was created and is controlled by rich men to protect their profits and property. As a result, we are left no viable alternative but to change the situation ourselves through illegal means. This is an act of self-defense against hate propaganda. These attacks were, as you might imagine, as you might remember, widely reported in the media. It's not surprising at all. It'd be weird if they weren't. What might be more surprising, however, is the reception. There were, without a doubt, criticisms of these actions, particularly by the pornography industry itself, but also the police, as well as anti-pornography activists who refused to endorse or sympathize with anything illegal. However, there was also a large and diverse middle ground, where activists negotiated cautious and sometimes overt forms of support for the Women's Fire Brigade. And here you can see a poster for a dance in celebration of the arsons. For example, on the day after the attack, the BC Federation of Women issued a statement that read, in part, quote, "While we did not participate in the firebombings of November the 22nd, 1982 in the Lower Mainland, we are in agreement with the frustration and anger of the women who did. We noted and appreciated their efforts to see that no one was hurt. We insist that Alan Williams, who was the Attorney General at the time, take action immediately to prevent rich men profiting from Red Hot Video's hate literature about women and children. The women of BC are being driven to desperate acts." Furthermore, the BC Federation of Women suggested in one of their reports that, quote, "Judging from the numerous calls and letters that flooded into Rape Relief and the Vancouver Status of Women, as well as local newspapers and radio talk shows, there were very few people who voiced strong opposition to the tactic chosen by the Women's Fire Brigade. Hundreds of women and men have called to offer support." Consistent with this reception, activists held a rally in downtown Vancouver in which women demonstrated their unabashed support for the Women's Fire Brigade. The organizers of the event even brought plastic firemen's helmets with them, which they distributed to the crowd. Adorned in these helmets and led by an octogenarian feminist who read the Women's Fire Brigade communique aloud, the crowd publicly celebrated the actions against Red Hot Video. Feminist groups in the city also practiced solidarity by refusing to allow debates over tactics to divide the women's community. Instead, they attempted to focus the debate on the nature of Red Hot Video's material and its connections to violence. The result of this coordinated action was an upsurge in anti-pornography organizing throughout the fall and winter of 1982 and 1983. So, while the advocates of nonviolence generally argue that armed actions lead to the repression of activist groups and therefore lead to a repression of above-ground community activism, the opposite took place in the context of Red Hot Video. In February of 1983, the feminist journal KINESIS, which had abstained from supporting or criticizing the arsons, argued that the bombing, quote, "combined with mounting public pressure against the porn video industry, has sparked unprecedented debate in the community." Another writer for KINESIS was even more direct in her assessment the following year, arguing that, quote, "the illegal nature of the actions was a source of debate among some women working against pornography, but most understood that the feminist community in some way benefited from them." Early in 1982, 2 months after the Women's Fire Brigade arsons, and 1 month after the province-wide picket against the franchise, the state finally turned on Red Hot Video. In January, the police raided 12 pornography stores across BC, confiscating hundreds of videotapes and charging at least one Red Hot video store with obscenity. Other Red Hot video locations bowed to public pressure and closed their doors, while one in Vancouver's West End had its lease cancelled by the property owner. Ultimately, however, anti-pornography activists in Vancouver and elsewhere did not succeed in halting the expansion of violent or sexist pornography, right? You know this. Instead, the scope and availability of those mediums has only increased with the internet. Nevertheless, as one activist told me, the importance of the Women's Fire Brigade never hinged on the promise of a world free from violent pornography. That task was much too vast for any one person or any one group to achieve. Instead, she argued that the actions against Red Hot Video demonstrated, quote, "We aren't powerless. You don't like something? Take it down." But the Women's Fire Brigade, as well as the broader history of the Direct Action Collective, also demonstrates something else. And that's the critical significance of understanding radicalism in context. If we see radicalism only as an isolated event, only as some random moment, then we're in a poor position from which to assess its meaning. But if we take it seriously, if we place radicals into their historical and political environments, then we're much better equipped. We can see that the work of Direct Action and the Women's Fire Brigade were not isolated or inexplicable moments. Rather, they were part of a much older and larger pattern of political militancy. So in sum, if we can better understand radicalism by putting it into its context, so too can we better understand Vancouver and its histories that we might not otherwise hear. Thank you for listening. Yeah, sure. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
Questions, anybody?
Just a comment that we now look back on the 70s as being a period of the greatest equality in income and opportunity that there has been. And yet out of that comes groups such as you've been describing. Do you have any kind of prediction or prescription of what's going on now? Are you seeing any parallels?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that explains what's happening, it's true that the 70s are a moment that in which people are doing quite well, but in many ways, only the first half of the 1970s. In the second half of the 1970s, you start to see basically the origins of the world that we live in today. It's in the 1970s that we get the neoliberal world that we have today. The recession, the oil crisis, all sorts of economic problems are happening. And when social credit comes into British Columbia, again, in the second half of the 70s, there's huge cuts to social services. And these things definitely agitated and radicalized people. So some of this activism was taking place in a context of affluence, and some of it wasn't, I guess, if that answers your question. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
What was the effect of the bombing on the hydro substation, and did that affect the positive effects of the Women's Fire Brigade, and how BC Hydro developed?
So what were the effects of the bombing of Chikai Dunsmuir? The effects of Chikai Dunsmuir were not as clear. So in a lot of ways, the campaign against BC Hydro already seemed to be lost. There wasn't a lot of hope that anything was going to happen, in part because BC Hydro was a much harder group to pressure than small independent merchants in Vancouver, right? This was the state. This was a company that had the full, Crown Corporation had the full backing of the political establishment. So the impacts of that bombing were not as clear, although before the bombing took place, there were other forms of civil disobedience and radical action against the hydroelectric line, and they did succeed in altering the pathway of the line, for example. So the corridor, the whole point or the backstory behind this action was that Vancouver Island was going to experience a not enough power. That's what BC Hydro said. So they wanted to bring power from the mainland, from new dams, over to Vancouver Island to fuel industrial development. And they were going to bring it from basically Sunshine Coast to Texada Island, onto Lasqueti Island, and then from Lasqueti Island over to Vancouver Island. And these power lines were huge steel towers, like a couple hundred meters across. So they basically cut a huge strip down the whole length of Texada, and they were going to go across Lasqueti. And Lasqueti revolted, basically, and said, you know, if you come to Lasqueti with your power lines, you will be bombed. Right? So they basically threatened radical direct action, continued to protest, and so BC Hydro basically shifted the line, because they could do that, right? It wasn't going to scrap the whole project, so they altered it. So radical action did shape that debate a little bit, but it wasn't as clear as the Red Hot video arsons. But it also wasn't as detrimental as you might think either. So there was very much a middle ground in the night. It's easy now to think about, or it's easy to assume in the wake of September 11th and the extensive war on terror that we've had for almost 15 years now, that the power and rhetoric of terrorism would be so powerful that people wouldn't take these direct actions. That's not the case in the 1970s and the early 1980s. People do these things, and they're not necessarily lambasted as terrorists. And that's incredibly interesting for somebody who's grown up mostly in the wake of September 11th.
Question?
Was there any point, the Women's Five Brigade, where they tried to come up with a new solution, such as, say, healthy pornography?
Yeah, there isn't, and that's something that you would expect to see, particularly now, where pornography is much more accepted within progressive communities. Not everybody feels that way, but if you're a young feminist, now, you know, you could go either way in terms of pornography. There's still lots of pushback against pornography, but at the end of the 1970s and the early 1980s, the room for dissent on pornography is very minimal. So the idea that they would be able to put forward healthy pornography, no. What they would promote would be erotica. But again, this idea about whether or not, like, what counts as erotica and what counts as pornography is very controversial, and still most feminist institutions and organizations in Vancouver do not speak openly. At least I don't think so. If someone else knows different, I'd love to hear about it. Do not speak openly about promoting erotica. The exception for that are within gay and lesbian communities. Gay and lesbian communities have, many of whom are sympathetic to the feminist movement, at least lesbian communities are, have a different take on pornography. But those perspectives don't often get articulated in journals such as KINESIS, I think probably because those communities didn't have as much sway over a lot of those institutions. But I might be wrong, I'm speculating.
Other questions? Eryk, one of the things that struck me is the flow of ideas. Right. You know, the two who went away and came back. I'm thinking of Greenpeace. Greenpeace was really about people from afar who, for various reasons, ended up here, and this becomes a very important part of our history of environmentalism and to some extent radicalism and challenging of conventional wisdom. But it was very much connected to a flow of ideas, and if we go back to the history of socialism, the socialists were all about channeling ideas, particularly in the British tradition in those days as well. So that's what struck me. We're going to leave it, and we'll go to the question afterwards. So anyway, on that note, thank you very much. Token of our appreciation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.